thank you everyone, and welcome back. I hope that you are enjoying your meal. This is a special lunchtime panel discussion, so whilst you eat, we are going to entertain you with a discussion about South Africa's upcoming elections in 2024, South Africa's watershed elections. And really, this represents, I think, the most consequential general election in South Africa's democratic history, post-1994. And there is a lot at stake. South Africa has a very competitive party political landscape, but the country, as some of our speakers previously has highlighted, is in something of a malaise. We have very high levels of official unemployment, north of 32%. Economic growth has flatlined. Last quarter we had 0.4% economic growth, which, given the levels of poverty in the country, is just simply not enough to improve the living conditions and the circumstances of many poor South Africans. So there are a lot of headwinds and a lot of policy issues that are potentially very inhibiting of free markets and of economic growth. We want to understand the origins of those, and then also explore some potential policy solutions. And the format of this panel is that we have something of a division. We have two politicians, two opposition politicians, and two analysts from the liberal think tank community. So to my left, we have John Steenhuisen, who is the federal leader of the Democratic Alliance. He's also the leader of the official opposition in Parliament. So welcome, John. Thanks for joining us. And then to his left, we have Mokone Maja, who is an analyst with the Center for Risk Analysis at the Institute of Race Relations. To her left, we have Nobuntu Hlazo Webster, who is the deputy leader of Build One South Africa, which is something of a new kid on the block, a new political party that is contesting at the 2024 elections and hoping to attract some support. To her left, we have Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, who is the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations. She's also the author of 11 books, the latest of which is Countdown to Socialism, which I'm very lucky to have an early copy of, which details the National Democratic Revolution, which is the ideological foundation of the ruling African National Congress. So I wanted to just offer the opportunity to each of these speakers to, in no more than 3 minutes per speaker, just to outline why they think South Africa's 2024 elections are so significant and what are going to be really the key policy and ideological issues that are going to really characterize that election. So maybe, John, we can start with you. What are the stakes next year, and what is potentially going to be the role of opposition parties like the Democratic Alliance in shaping that outcome?
Well, thank you, David, and greetings to my fellow panelists as well and to the audience. It's really great to be here today. Look, I think the next election is, without a doubt, going to be the most important election in post-democratic South Africa. Without a doubt, it's going to be a hinge of history election. And like a hinge, it can go in one of two directions. It can go the right way, it can very much go the wrong way. And obviously, as an opposition party, we are very invested in making sure that the country goes the right way, that we're able to get South Africa off this high debt, low growth, high unemployment trajectory and onto a new trajectory of hope, prosperity, and opportunity, particularly for the 30 million South Africans who live below the poverty line in the country. It's also an important election because it is the first election in post-democratic South Africa where the outcome is not a foregone conclusion. The ANC in the last local government election achieved below 50%. They ended up around 47%. The combined non-ANC EFF opposition received around 35% of the vote. We believe that given the advent of load shedding, the massive unemployment crisis in South Africa, the crisis with personal and public safety, where 71 people are murdered every single day in the country, the chronic failure of service delivery, and the failure of the education system are going to mean that there is an opportunity, if opposition parties can work together, to be able to make good that 16% difference by doing a number of things. First of all, by ending the squabbling between opposition parties and focusing on providing an alternative vision for South Africa, where we can put on the table the type of policies, the type of priorities that we think are important to get the country moving forward again. And in doing so, to ignite hope, again, amongst the 14 million South Africans who are registered to vote but have not voted in the last 2 elections, and the 13 million voters in the country who are just not registered to vote, mainly young people. Considering the ANC got just over 5.1 million votes in the last election, if we can just drill down into 10% of each of those groups and grow the opposition vote, I believe we can make good that and build a new majority to be able to move the country forward. We can have the best ideas as opposition parties. We can come up with the best plans. We can put the most wonderful policies on the table. If we don't have a path to power and don't have an ability to get into power, those remain ideas, plans, and policies. We want to get them implemented. And we've seen through, certainly our experience in gaining governments in the Western Cape, at the city of Cape Town, and many of the other places where we've been able to get into government, that is when you get into power that you can change people's lives.
Thanks, John. So, Mokone, you spend a lot of time as an analyst at the Center for Risk Analysis briefing your clients, corporates and other institutions in South Africa, and you help them to understand what are the socioeconomic conditions that are prevailing in the country at the moment. Could you help us to understand where is South Africa now in the present, and where is it heading, and what role does policy play in influencing some of those socioeconomic outcomes?
Yeah. Thank you, David. Good afternoon, fellow panelists, and to the audience at large. I think our role as analysts currently is to manage the very high risk profile that the country is today, right? You spoke earlier about economic growth. It's always worth mentioning that initially South Africa's economic growth was pegged at 1.1% until the IMF came over to South Africa and did a sort of tour in stakeholder management and wiped out that 1% entirely and just said what's left is 0.1% of likely growth in South Africa. So currently I think what you're able to see after nearly, if not exactly 3 decades since the dawn of democracy, is consolidating exactly what the national ruling party has been able to do so far, looking at what those policies that were effected have produced 3 decades later, and whether one can still really rely on discrepancies or discrimination of the past as a reason for why South Africa is in the position that it's in today. So essentially, we have failed with the basics, things like safety and security, things like infrastructure, education, health, all those areas where you see big allotted amounts of our national spending allocated to are not producing the desired results. So our role in managing expectations of our clients is really just to present those statistics, and hopefully that influences how people vote in anticipation of the 2024 elections.
Okay, thanks, Mokone. Nobuntu, your party, Build One South Africa, has recently come onto the scene. Why is it necessary for us to have another political party? And what are you bringing to this election? What is your differentiation from, say, other political parties? And why this election? Why is this a significant election?
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for the invitation. And good afternoon to fellow panelists and to the audience. So, I mean, we've all been talking about what we've seen in terms of political landscape in South Africa, and in previous elections, what we've seen happen with regards to the results we see where we have a dominant party in the country. What's clear from that is that South Africans have not been convinced with any of the opposition parties of their ability to be able to govern on their own in South Africa. There's a good and a bad side to that. The good side is that when democracy is fully expressed, it is with a multi-party system where you see various parties that are coming to the fore. And so this is an opportunity for us to be able to see South Africans represented fully in the political spectrum. So that's the first thing to say. Now, when we speak about where we're at as South Africans, I always speak from the perspective of a South African and not necessarily from the perspective of a politician, because first and foremost, I'm a leader in South Africa who has decided to serve my country in the public domain. South Africans today, when you think of, for instance, a 17-year-old who will be 18 and voting next year, some 20-something-year-olds, there are many of those South Africans who have actually never seen the system work. So we're coming into an election where there's a generation that has never seen their parents work. There's a generation that has never seen the healthcare system work, that's been let down by the healthcare system, that has seen relatives, neighbors, and friends die at the hands of a healthcare system that doesn't work. You have South Africans that has not seen the education system work because they've come out of an education system that did not prepare them for the world of work, that has not seen an economy that works for them because while their parents have never worked, they have little chance of working themselves when we have an expanded definition of over 60% of the youth in this country unemployed. So they are watershed elections and important elections because it is essential and critical that we turn the country around if we're not to have a failing state. So as a citizen, the important thing that a citizen thinks about going into the election is, will this party or will this collective of parties be able to turn around the infrastructure and just the basic systems that we have in this country to be able to serve me and to be able to serve my community? That's the first most important thing coming into this election. The second is the issue of the economy. I mean, we've had all the panelists and yourself, David, speak now about where the economy is in South Africa, the dire straits that we find in the economy in South Africa. And one of the things that we really need to look at and to start thinking about is how do we develop policy that creates an economy that's expansive, so that expands, because currently you have the mainstream economy and government being the ones who are contributing to employment in South Africa primarily. So you need to be able to expand the economy, to be able to grow entrepreneurship in the economy, to be able to expand the economy beyond the geographical lines of just cities in South Africa and start to see townships and rural areas have thriving economies as well. So that's on the economy. And lastly, you need to be able to have a leadership in this country, collaborative leadership in this country between political parties, to be able to have a multi-party system that works, that is pragmatic, and that is about addressing the issues that we face in South Africa today.
Okay, thanks, Nobuntu. So, Anthea, as I mentioned in my introduction, you've written this book, Countdown to Socialism, which catalogues in quite meticulous detail the effect that the ruling African National Congress, its ideological agenda has on policy and how that is impacted on all spheres of South Africa. And as your colleague Chris Hatting so eloquently described in his opening remarks, policy is really downstream from ideology, and the IR is engaged in this battle of ideas. Could you help us to explain this concept of the National Democratic Revolution and how that plays out, and how to potentially we as liberal organizations could counter the effects of that?
Thank you, David, and I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you to you, to all the fellow panelists with me, and to the audience. And thanks also for the shout-out for my book, which I've been wanting to write for a long time, because I think that ANC ideology is so important. The ANC obtained the idea of the National Democratic Revolution from the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And the idea was always that as colonies became independent with mostly capitalist economies, so they would shift to socialism and in time to communism. Now, this was all a long time ago that the idea was worked out. And one might imagine that in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the disbandment of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that this idea would have come to an end. But in fact, there are many socialist parties, communist parties, left-leaning analysts and commentators across the world who still believe in the socialist ideal, who think that all the repression that happened in the Soviet Union, in Mao's China and elsewhere was really irrelevant, because they say it wasn't real socialism that was tried there. And what we will have in the future is real socialism. It will be democratic, participatory. There will be no central planning. There will be no repression. It will work extremely well. And therefore, one can discount the 100 million deaths that occurred in the 20th century through socialism and its implementation. So our ANC-SACP alliance is deeply committed to socialism despite its failures in the past, because they agree that real socialism has never been tried. And what they wanted to do when they took power in 1994 was to use state power to implement the National Democratic Revolution over a period of 30 to 40 years. And it's being implemented in at least 17 different spheres that I covered in the book. There are others besides as well, which makes it, of course, very difficult to describe it in a nutshell and in a short space of time. But remember the objective. If you're trying to take the country from primarily capitalist to socialist, you cannot do so while the capitalist economy is thriving. If we had a situation of very low unemployment, if people had a feeling of growing prosperity, many opportunities outside those provided by the state, there would be absolutely no reason at all for anybody to support a further expansion of state power. It's only, for example, in the land reform sphere, that because land reform has been handled so very badly, and the ANC keeps saying that land reform is the key to solving poverty, that people can have any possible thought that perhaps expropriation without compensation would be a good thing. They have created an environment in which the idea is not immediately laughed out of court, but is perhaps given some serious consideration. So what we see with the implementation of the National Democratic Revolution is that the ANC generally tries to cripple the economy so that it doesn't work well. It has very little interest in a thriving, well-educated, self-reliant population, even though it claims the contrary. What it is interested in is expanding the power and the reach of the state, despite not having the competence to carry out those powers well. If we're going to be able to counter the NDR, we need, first of all, to understand it. And secondly, we need to understand that it's already gone far. In the last 30 years, it's been implemented in these many areas. It's already had great impact in damaging the society. And as John was saying, 2024 is a watershed election because we cannot afford to let the NDR keep playing out. And if one uses EWC as the one area where there's a particular ambition to push that now forward very strongly, we should also think about what happened in a country like Venezuela, where GDP has contracted by 70% in the last 10 years. South Africa hasn't yet got to a point in the NDR where we are facing that kind of economic disaster, but we can get to that point in the NDR where we face precisely such a terrible situation. So what we need to do is to recognize that we do still have a functioning democracy, that the next election is coming in 2024, and that there is now, for the first time, because of a growing disillusionment with the ANC, a realistic prospect of voting it out of power and then being able to set about creating a new set of policies that will offer a better life to all South Africans.
Thanks, Anthea. Yeah, and I think the Venezuelan example shows that things can get very bad. And even if the economy contracts by 70%, which is almost unthinkable, the politicians in charge still find a way of benefiting from that, and their interests are not actually negatively impacted. So often we have these discussions, we say, surely the government wouldn't be willing to take that risk, but actually history and other contemporary examples show that is in fact the case. So, John, there's a lot at stake next year, and we often talk about multi-party democracy, but we certainly do have multiple parties in South Africa. You lead one of the more established opposition parties, if not the most established. And the voters are going to be confronted with a very long ballot paper when they enter the ballot box next year. And you have very publicly come out to propose what you've phrased as the Moonshot Pact. And most of our audience is not South African today. What is a Moonshot Pact, and what are you hoping to achieve with it?
So what the pact seeks to do is to bring together like-minded opposition parties around a common set of values and principles, and to come together and stop wasting resources, squabbling amongst each other, and to accept that the country is in such a deep crisis that it's time to put aside scars of battles past, to put aside petty differences, and focus on the 10 to 15 things that we agree on that need to be done to rescue the country and to break this terrible trajectory. So whilst we may have different opinions and different views on certain things, surely we can all agree that we've got to reform the education system. Surely we can all agree that we've got to fix the energy crisis in the country. Surely we've got to agree we've got to modernize policing in South Africa to keep our citizens safe. And it's to come up then with a program of action, a set of policies that we can put before the electorates at the next election and say, these are our priorities. This is our plan to fix South Africa, and here is our pathway to victory to do it. So what there's never been for the opposition since 1994 is that pathway to victory. I've set out already the 35%, and any proportional system going into an election with 35% already in the bag is a huge advantage. And I've already set out how we intend to get that working together. But it's only going to work if the politicians are prepared to put aside the egos, if we are prepared to make compromises in a mature, pragmatic way, and that we are set about setting out that alternative. It can't just be, well, we want to get the ANC out. We've got to get the ANC out, and we want to do the following things. So the pact as well is not a coalition, because you can only have a coalition after an election. A pact is an agreement by parties going into an election that should we be able to form a majority, these are the things we would like to see happen in South Africa. And what it would also do is gives the parties a long runway of a year to iron out any of the potential differences that have tripped up coalitions in the past, to be able to come up with that program of action, to have a high degree of consensus, to have an understanding about how disputes would be dealt with, so that we're able to bring to the fore in South Africa a stable coalition that can focus from day one on a program of action, of change, of hope and opportunity for the country. That's never happened in South Africa before. And it's called it, well, I called it a moonshot. The name will probably change as we seek consensus and move on. But it is yes, it used to be a long shot, but in modern usage, it's a giant leap forward. It's great progress. And I think for South Africa to transition out of this terrible situation it finds itself in now, we need this giant leap forward. And I believe the Moonshot Pact, or the Pact, or the Compact, or whatever it's going to be called, provides for the first time a consolidated way for us to build that alternative majority in South Africa that can focus on righting the wrongs. It can focus on helping the 30 million people who are trapped in poverty in an insider-outsider economy. And it can, I believe, restore South Africa's credibility amongst its own people, but also internationally.
And so, John, how has this Moonshot Pact proposal been received by some of the other opposition parties?
Well, the majority of the parties that make up the bulk of the electoral vote system are on board. We've been involved on Thursday night meetings with the leaders of those parties, where we've been able to build up a sufficient consensus on the issues and the principles and the values that have brought us together for us to now proceed to the next stage, which will be a national convention taking place on the 16th and 17th of August. What we hope to emerge from that is a document setting out those values and principles, setting out what we hope to achieve for the country, but also commitment to then working over the remaining months to flesh out that offer to South Africans. Obviously, we're hoping that by the time we reach the 16th and 17th of August, that we would have more parties on board, parties that share those values and principles, parties who want to be part of building a new majority, and parties that are prepared to put aside those differences and the egos to be able to give South Africans the very best shot they have of throwing off the yoke of one-party ANC domination and opening up a new era of consensual, mutually beneficial, collaborative politics that sees parties across the board bringing the very best and brightest of their talents together around a table to solve the problems that the country has. We're never going to fix the problems we have in this country with the architects of the situation we find ourselves in sitting around the cabinet table. We need to reinvigorate, re-energize, and to ensure that we can give South Africans that hope that tomorrow can be better than yesterday.
So in Ubuntu, John has laid out quite a compelling argument for the opposition parties to consolidate and to focus their efforts on this big prize of dismantling or dislodging the ANC from power. You, at Build One South Africa, even as your name suggests, you're wanting to build this united front. Will Bosa be joining the Moonshot Pact? And if not, what are some of your misgivings?
So, we were invited to the Moonshot Pact meetings, and we've sat in on some of them. So we're absolutely open to engagements when it comes to the Moonshot Pact or any other coalition. So one of the things that we have to give clarity on is that we are absolutely for collaboration, and we know for sure that we will be part of a collaborative effort or a coalition with other political parties come 2024. But what has to be the basis of that is, first of all, you need to have a neutral convener. You need to have a convener that brings together political parties, that doesn't have a sense of already assuming a position of leadership in that coalition, because that has to be decided by the collective. Secondly, the coalition has got to be representative. It's got to be representative of South Africans, and it cannot have a sense of exclusivity or preconditions that already, before you even enter into the coalition, there are preconditions that have been set, and you already assume a position of there are decisions that already have been made about the shape and form of the coalition before everybody is already in the room. And I think lastly, John speaks a lot to the issue of there has to be a sense that there's no egos and it's about the country. And I absolutely agree with that. There has to be a sense in the coalition that we are going to be able to look beyond ideology and to be able to take a pragmatic approach that addresses the current challenges, issues, and crises in many instances in this country.
Okay, and I think the electorate probably opens the newspaper or scrolls through Twitter and sees a lot of those egos fighting with one another, and probably a bit put off by that. So, I think it's okay to have differences of policy and opinion, but as you say, there are trade-offs that have to be made, and you sometimes need to collaborate with people who don't exactly share your worldview.
Absolutely, hence the comment on preconditions. So when preconditions exist, it means that, first of all, when there's exclusivity and preconditions, it means there's no opportunity to look beyond those squabbles, to look beyond those differences, and to let others into the room, to be able to see whether there could perhaps be a point of meeting or a point of convergence.
Before I get to the analysts on the panel, I'd like to give John an opportunity to respond to that.
I think it is important that it is clarified. First of all, there is going to be an independent convener, and there'll be announcements on that. The parties have been sitting in their meetings and determined a internationally recognized group of people who are going to come in and convene it. It's not going to be done by any one party. Also, the meetings that we've been having at the leaders has been on a rotational chairing basis. So every leader of a party who's been part of the meetings has had an opportunity to chair, and that's to create the joint ownership. But you have to have some preconditions, because otherwise you then fall into the same trap the DA did in 2016, where we went into an arrangement at local government level with the economic freedom fighters. And where there is such an ideological gulf between the two of you, you actually cannot make something work, because you end up then compromising your internal values and principles just for the sake of being inclusive. So the only preconditions that have been set for participation in this process is very clear. Do you believe in non-racialism? Do you respect the Constitution and uphold the rule of law? Do you believe in a social market economy that treats business and the private sector as partners in the growth agenda? Do you agree that we must have a zero tolerance to corruption? And fifthly, are you committed to building a capable state free of cadre deployment? Those are the only preconditions that have been set. Because if you fundamentally don't believe in those things, there's no point in us sitting around the table, because we're going to end up in a situation where we end up being in government, let's say, with the EFF. And if you lay the EFF 7 pillars over those 5 values and principles, there's a clear disjunction. How can you govern with a party that doesn't believe in the free market and a social market economy, that doesn't believe in the Constitution and the rule of law, because then, and wants to expropriate without compensation? Like, you end up then with a governing coalition made up of the same mess the ANC are in at the moment, with 3 different organizations that are trying to pull the country in different ways. So I want to be very clear, there are no preconditions. I've also made it very, very clear, and this is important, that this is not elect the DA, the president campaign, not at all. We've seen very clear right from the beginning, from the name to who the presidential candidate will be, everything is on the table, it's open to discussion. So the invitation is open, it's made with an open hand and a generous hand, but it's not made to parties who don't share those 5 fundamental values and principles, because we've learnt the hard way that being into government with people who don't share the values and principles, you eventually end up compromising yourself. And then you do what you don't ever want to do in politics, is become that you built up to remove from office, which can happen very, very quickly in politics.
Makone, you do you want to respond
Yes.
very briefly, Nobuntu, and then we'll move on to the other panelists. So.
Briefly, that's why it becomes important to bring the people in the room and allow them to be the ones who determine whether or not they agree or disagree with the preconditions. Because you can't make that decision already, that presupposition that there are parties or there are organizations that do not agree with those preconditions means that there's already a party within the room that has final say in as to whether people participate in those decisions or not. So that is a precondition, because it means that you've not allowed the people to come into the room and to be able to say, actually, we don't agree with this, it's fine, we're out. So really, inclusivity means allowing the people to be able to make that decision. And also, I spoke earlier about being able to look beyond ideological lines. There are some parties in the room that have ideological differences, but they're there, right? Because the point of it is to look beyond ideological lines and become pragmatic and practical and solutions-driven. So you cannot say that you cannot work with a party where there's ideological differences, because there will definitely be ideological differences in the room anyway.
Okay, well, maybe we'll unpack that concept of ideology and why it's important. But John, I'll get back to you a little bit later. I want to bring Makone into this discussion. Makone, the Center for Risk Analysis conducts scenario planning. So you're not in the business of making predictions per se, but you are applying your mind to different situations or eventualities that may transpire. Could you explain to us your scenario planning methodology that you present to your clients? And what are some of the potential scenarios that we might see in the middle of next year when we have our national elections?
Yeah. So our methodologies around scenario planning are centered around polls. We look at various polls that are conducted throughout the country, but also over the period of time of, say, 10 years, just looking at what exactly, what sort of temperature do you detect from where South Africans are at in terms of political parties and which way they are inclined. Of course, the polls are not an indicator of who people are going to vote for, but they help you get a sense of exactly where people's minds are aligned at any particular time. That's also very important, because obviously the political climate is very volatile and things change very rapidly in South Africa. And then we also base a lot of our polls on we have internal polls, but we also rely on external polls from different publications. There's a lot of newspapers that do their own polls. And in addition to that, we also look at by-elections. We think they're a good metric of also measuring temperature in South Africa as to whether people, how people perceive different political parties. Currently, we have about 5 scenarios that we're working with, and 4 of those scenarios see the ANC retain power one way or another, and that's how we divide the distribution of ANC vote share come 2024 is in that first scenario, we see the ANC group with a couple of other parties, although you will see that recently they made a statement that they're not even considering coalitions at all. They're gunning for majoritarianism come 2024, but we have them pegged currently at clustering with a bunch of other smaller parties. Our second scenario sees the ANC go into a coalition with a party like the EFF, which we predict will be more volatile and cause a lot more instability economically and politically in the country, as these countries are more extreme left-wing aligned. Our third scenario would see the ANC go into a coalition with the DA, but we think that may not be very likely, and so that's smaller on the scale. And then we also see the DA with other parties as one of our options, which is what we are debating currently, the Moonshot Pact, but that's definitely in there as a scenario. And then lastly, our last scenario would see the DA with smaller other parties.
Okay, and the polling that the CRA does influences a lot of your thinking around this, and those polls are demographically representative, they're longitudinal, so there's different time points where we poll people, so you're able to gauge where public sentiment is. Do you have an idea of public sentiment towards this idea of a coalition between opposition parties?
So currently our polls are focused around what South Africa's or South Africans' biggest concerns are, and we ask them to rate those concerns in order of greatest importance to least important. And throughout the years, it just never seems to fluctuate too drastically, but South Africans are very much concerned with things like unemployment, safety and security, infrastructural breakdowns like energy. Currently, energy security is a big issue in South Africa. And then, like right at the bottom, you see things like land reform, affirmative action, that sort of thing. So we haven't yet seen the political instability or the role of coalitions really play a role in people being pulled in that direction as it being a great concern of theirs yet. That's
very interesting, because often the political elite and the intelligentsia make a big fuss about race relations in the country as being the prevailing issue. But actually your polling suggests that it ranks a lot lower, and that people care more about material things like access to jobs and so on.
Absolutely. I think you always get the sense that South Africans are always perceived one way, and yet the polls show that South Africans are pragmatic people and fairly conservative, just worried about the country actually operating efficiently. And really, issues of employment and safety and security are the absolute basics. So we shouldn't even see them ranking that highly on the polls, but they tend to really worry South Africans a lot. And you do get the sense that issues around race relations are really peddled by political elites.
So Anthea, I'll turn to you now. I want to unpack this idea of ideology and why it's significant. So John has said that there are certain values or preconditions that will need to be in place for his party to enter this pact with other opposition parties. Nobuntu said that we need to look beyond ideology. I want to understand this relationship between ideology and policy, and what are the kinds of liberal policies that we as individual freedom-loving organizations, what would we like to see on the policy agenda? What kind of reforms are needed in South Africa to unlock growth and prosperity?
Right. Well, I think that it's critically important to start by recognizing the great harm that the ANC has done over 30 years by pursuing the National Democratic Revolution and its socialist ideology, by not recognizing the importance of the market. And certainly there needs to be provision for people who are old, who are ill, who need to be taken care of. But the market principle is vital. And if we find that some opposition coalition is still flirting with socialism in some way, then I fear that we will not have made the kind of breakthrough that we need to. In terms of specific policies, I think also referring to some of the polling that the Institute of Race Relations has done, we've been asking people about BEE, for example, and how much they feel they benefit from it for a while. And the answer which seems to come back quite often is that there's a small group of people within the black majority who do feel that they've benefited from BEE. But the great majority, about 85% of black South Africans, don't see that they've benefited from it, which makes sense because they are never going to be the ones that take part in an ownership deal or get a preferential contract or a new small business to run. And they're not going to be appointed as the managers in the state or elsewhere. On the whole, BEE just passes them by. But worse than that, it very often harms them because the government is extraordinarily corrupt as a result of BEE, and procurement is the worst example. Andre de Ruyter talks about the wooden mop, the simple wooden mop that you can buy in the supermarket for about 50 Rand, being offered to Eskom for 230,000 Rand. Now, that's an extraordinary example. But our former finance minister complained about how the private sector can build a school for 10 million Rand, but for the government it costs 40 million Rand. And why is that? Because too many of the contracts go to the friends and relations of councillors, of officials, and so on. And the efficiency is not there, the delivery is not there, the costs go up. And the people who absolutely bear the brunt of that are the poorest people, who now have one school where they could have 10, which is what not 10, 4 is my arithmetic. But that's what we need to make sure that our scarce resources are used as best possible. And BEE cuts across that completely. So one of the things we've asked in polling is, what do you think would help you better? Would you like to have an education voucher funded by the state, taking some of the revenue that's now being badly used by the government in running public schools, and made that available to you as a parent, as a family, so that you can choose what school you want your child to go to? And the schools around you must compete for your custom. They must hold fees down, they must push quality up so that they will be the school that you choose. And once you're a customer of the schools, the whole kind of power relationship changes. You don't have to just accept whatever bad school the state provides. You have private business competing for your custom. You have many state schools also available to you. You have perhaps religious schools available to you. There's a choice. And many people have said more than once that something like that would help them far more than BEE. And we've said the same idea could be applied in healthcare and it could be applied in housing. And it would mean a much more efficient use of limited state resources, a real empowerment of people at the grassroots, and something that would reach right down to people where they are and give them a hope of a better life, a real chance of a better life, in which they know very well that BEE won't do. So it's the sort of policy initiative that could be looked at by an opposition coalition. Is it possible to find ways to use money much better, to really reach down into the grassroots level and help the people who are most in need of help, rather than sticking with policies that lend themselves to corruption and have really only helped the relative elite?
Ubuntu, Anthea makes a very good point there about education vouchers. I did see somewhere that your party leader, Musi Maimane, endorsed this concept. Is this a serious policy proposal that BOSA has wanted to put on the table? And what other strategies could you pursue that really strengthen the autonomy and the agency of individuals in the way that Anthea has described, rather than the kind of broad categories of people, like according to their race or their ethnicity or what have you?
So absolutely. I think, so one of the first things to recognize is that there is historical context in South Africa. And it is important that economic policy recognizes that. However, I agree with Anthea that triple BEE hasn't worked, because what triple BEE has done is that it's only been able to empower a small group of people, and by its very design, that's what it was going to do. But there's definitely opportunity to look at the material circumstance of South Africans as a result of the historical context, and to be able to redirect investment into, for instance, areas where you find townships, for instance, that have been on the margins of the economy. So as BOSA, we have the Justice Fund as one of our policy proposals, which would look at taking money, for instance, from the sale of the IDC shares, because why does government have to have ownership in IDC shares? Money that is from businesses that want to invest in growing the economy. And using those funds from the Justice Fund to be able to build township economies, to be able to build SMEs in the township. And that really speaks to ownership, because first of all, what triple BEE did is that it put a dependency on the mainstream economy, which is in itself limited, to be able to transform the economy in South Africa, first of all, which is really a problem. But what it didn't do was to give a broad opportunity for South Africans to be able to participate, access to opportunity to be able to own businesses, to be able to run businesses. And so what the Justice Fund would do is it would do that, particularly to those who even geographically have, because of spatial injustice, have been on the outskirts of the economy and of what happens there. The education vouchers are also an opportunity where, dependent on the performance of children, you're able to give them opportunity to access schools that they would otherwise not have accessed before. So the education voucher is something that sits within our 10-point plan, and it's something that we endorse and that we're working on and that we're refining in terms of how could this work, where you actually democratize access to education and you're able to say to children, you are not limited as to where you can study on the basis of where you found yourself living because of the history of this country.
So Anthea has spoken about empowerment for the economically disadvantaged. You have expressed your party's commitment to non-racialism. And as Anthea has documented in her book, BEE has been used as cover for essentially rent-seeking and patronage distribution to the incumbent elite. What alternatives is the DA considering in terms of alleviating poverty, uplifting the many poor South Africans, that is not based on their racial characteristics?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, you've got to start from the point you analyze a policy not on its noble objectives, but on its outcomes. And any objective analysis of triple BEE will show you that over the period that it's been applied, black South African households have got 10% poorer, black unemployment in the country has expanded, and the inequality gap has widened, not narrowed. And so on all of those metrics, it's very clear the policy has failed. But I think there's a more fundamental problem, and that is the whole way in which government sees the issues that are wrong in South Africa. And I would advance the thesis that they're looking at the problem from the wrong end of the pipe or the wrong side of the equation. So if you imagine the equation, you've got equality of opportunity in the front, and on the other side of the equation is equality of outcome. Government has spent the last 25 years focusing almost all of its energy on trying to create and manage an equality of outcome. If you focus on the other side of the equation, the equality of opportunity, can you imagine the difference if every child, rural, urban, rich or poor, had access to a quality education? If everybody, like they do in the Western Cape, had a primary healthcare facility within 5 kilometers? If we had a decent university access system, allowed people more access to university, if we had a growing economy where people had access to jobs, you're then creating that equality of opportunity, which means then that you have less to manage on the equality of outcome. And you can do all of the equality of opportunity things without resorting to the skewed race-based things that have the disastrous consequences that that Anthea has outlined already by focusing on a non-racial way on poverty. Poverty can be measured. There's international measurements, the international poverty line. And if you focus your empowerment policies and your upliftment policies using poverty as the measure, you're going to be far more broad-based. You're going to be far more targeted. You're going to automatically exclude the already empowered. And it is already a system that is in place in a variety of other aspects of life. The SASSA grant, or the old age pension, doesn't look at your race. It looks at your income level and says you qualify. NSFAS does the same. It doesn't look at your race. It says you qualify. And in doing so and orienting towards poverty, your government intervention is going to focus automatically on the 30 million people in South Africa who live below the poverty line. Because of the historical context that Ubuntu talks about, 99.7% of those are black South Africans. So without having to resort to slavish race-based policies, you're able to direct government assistance and resource to where it is most needed, and that is the poor in South Africa.
Well, I'm conscious of time, and there's a lot to discuss. I would love to dwell more on this topic, but I'm also aware that a lot of our audience here today is not from South Africa, and as South Africans, I think we're sometimes guilty of being a bit insular in our mentality, a bit inward-looking. And I'm sure many of the delegates here today are curious about how the potential political realignment in South Africa next year might impact South Africa's relations with the rest of the continent. And I think very sadly and unfortunately, South Africa has a notorious reputation for xenophobia, and we've had these flare-ups and these attacks, anti-foreigner sentiment. So for all the highfalutin language around Pan-Africanism, when it comes down to it, there's a lot of animosity sometimes towards other African countries. So Ubuntu, your party has been very conscious to make linkages with other opposition parties in places like Zimbabwe and Zambia and Uganda, I believe. Could you explain what can be learned from your party's experience and how opposition parties from around the continent can share expertise and strategies to affect change in their own countries?
Absolutely. I think the first of that is that you look at a country like Zambia and you consider their transition to a multi-party government, and there's much to learn from that. You look at Ghana and the peaceful transition and post the transitions, the elections that they've had, and there's much for us to learn from that. But additional to that, you know, I spoke about how we're focused on an economy that is expansive and inclusive. And part of that, and really I want to underscore this, to say that currently as it stands now, the economy, because we focus on the mainstream economy, because we focus on government's ability to create employment, cannot absorb the level of unemployment we have in South Africa. And that's the truth for many other countries in the region. And so what becomes important in building these relationships is to be able to foster relations as we grow in government in our respective countries. Because you look, for instance, at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which could make such a difference, you know, for many countries and could expand economies, as we talk about expansion and inclusion. But that needs political will. It needs for there to be relationships between countries, between nations, and for there to be a political will to be able to enforce and to be able to implement what is outlined in that trade agreement. And often when we talk about bilateral agreements, we often think of big business and never take into consideration small and medium enterprises, which when you look at the potential they have in many countries in the region, and you look at the ability now of small and medium enterprises to be able to trade on the continent, it's an absolute game changer for the continent and then for those respective economies. So that's the importance of those relationships. That's why we've been intentional and made it a focus to be able to build those relationships. We speak often of the informal economy. And I mean, just in South Africa, a third of the employment comes from the informal economy. But there has not been the right kind of focus. When I speak about us creating special economic zones in the township, you have to start looking at those informal economies and figuring out how do you scale them, how do you accelerate them, how do you then enable them to be able to trade beyond our borders on the continent. And then we'll start to see a difference because we will essentially then really be expanding the economy.
So I would say that international relations has not been a topic that has featured very highly on South Africa's political agenda up until very recently. And South Africa's position on the war in Ukraine has attracted a lot of global attention, and some of our traditional allies are starting to question South Africa's commitment to the international legal system, to seeing a peaceful outcome in Ukraine, despite its ostensible neutrality and impartiality. John, I know you've been to Ukraine, and you also recently in Poland discussing how to roll back authoritarianism. How is South Africa positioned in terms of its international relations now, and how might that change under a prospective opposition government?
Well, I think South Africa's got itself in a terrible muddle with international relations, and it's not based on any sense of policy or strategy. It just seems to be an ad hoc, well, we like them, they helped us then, and we then owe them some allegiance. But the reality is, if you have to look at foreign relations from a pragmatic perspective as well. And the reality is that 77% of all foreign direct investment into South Africa comes from the UK, the European Union, and the United States of America. Now, you juxtapose that with the 6% of foreign direct investment that comes from Russia and China combined. Why are we putting at risk 77% of our foreign direct investment that creates jobs in our local market, that allows us to be able to trade and get South African goods into other countries? Why are we putting that at risk to help out or position ourselves in where we are supporting Putin? And let's not kid ourselves. South Africa is not neutral in this conflict. Neutrality is not having war games with one of the countries that's involved in the conflict in the midst of it, sending emissaries to Moscow every few months. South Africa is not by any semblance of reality neutral. So there's going to have to be a reset. We're going to have to look at what's in the interests of South Africa. Now, it doesn't mean you have to choose BRICS or choose the other, but you've got to approach both of those in a pragmatic way. We don't have a single bilateral trade agreement with any BRICS country. We've got AGOA with the US, we've got the bilateral trade agreement with the EU and the UK. We benefit massively from those. It's worth nurturing those, but it also means that we have to be pragmatic. But we also have to be consistent. And I noticed from the President's affidavit that he tried very hard this week to keep from the people of South Africa, that he waxes lyrical about the sovereignty of South Africa and the like, without any hint of the irony that there's a complete disregard for the sovereignty of what's happened in Ukraine. So I think there's a time for a reset in South Africa's international relations, and that's certainly what I think that an opposition coalition should seek doing. And that's why I agree with Nobuntu as well. We should also be looking at how we can do more trade on the continent as well, how we can open up more opportunities on the continent, but also reducing the number of embassies around the world, turning our embassies into trade missions, focused with one thing and one thing only, taking a human rights approach to foreign relations, but also actively seeking the jobs, the investment that we need in South Africa to get our economy growing, particularly the unskilled, large manufacturing jobs, where South Africa should be a natural destination for. But because of the policies, we don't have electricity. Water is a problem. Huge problems with crime. Huge red tape issues. Visa regime that is archaic. And all of these things drive opportunity away from South Africa. So I'd like to see us having a reset and looking at how pragmatically we can use foreign relations and our foreign policy to advance the ideals entrenched in our constitution around the world, but then also to bring what we need most, which is jobs and opportunity and investment for our people.
Yeah, the French statesman Charles de Gaulle, he said that countries have interests, they don't have friends. And I think South Africa needs to be quite tactical with its international relations. And I think many of the strange positions that it takes are, in fact, ideological. Isn't that right, Anthea? Well, we've reached the end of the discussion, but I'd like to just leave you all with last comments from each of the panelists. And given that we have an African audience from around the continent today, I would like perhaps to frame it as what can other African countries learn from our experience of multi-party democracy, and what can we learn from the rest of the continent? Anthea, would you like to go first?
Perhaps just to foster any system of multi-party democracy, recognize that it can be fragile, and really, cherish it, keep it alive, don't let it be undermined. And the same with an economy. And as we were talking about, people are absolutely desperate for employment, and you're not going to get employment without investment and growth. And so therefore, to foster all the conditions that will enable you to make your country more attractive to others, and particularly from our point of view, not to waste the resources and the infrastructure with which we began in 1994, but to make sure that we use them to absolutely best effect.
Nobuntu?
I'd say that it's important that as African nations, we start to put ourselves first. I mean, you asked that question about South Africa and our international affairs, but I think as a continent, it's time we started putting ourselves first. It's time we started looking at relationships with the world and with each other in a way that benefits us as countries and in a way that benefits us as a continent. And I would say that there's much that we can learn from each other, and there's great opportunity for us to engage with one another in the way that we boost our economies and in the way that we transition our governments and our democracies and move them forward.
Yeah, just on our democracy, I would say South Africa is a fairly robust democracy. We still have free and fair elections. We have a somewhat active electorate, and all those things are amiable. And so with African countries looking up to South Africa, I think just creating some of those reinforcements would probably be beneficial, especially if you look at moving into common law as a system of operating through the economy. It's always a good thing to aspire to. And then on the economic front, I think the question is not what should government do. It's about them getting out of the way altogether and letting free markets really occupy those spaces.
There's that famous quote, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Never take democracy for granted. It can change in an election season, as many countries have seen. Nurture your free media. Nurture and jealously protect your independent judiciary. Make sure that the institutions are stronger than the politicians. And make sure that you actively promote participation by your electorate in the elective processes. Allied with that, I would say focus on economic growth, because many of the problems that you face, from xenophobia to a tearing of the social fabric, can be exactly linked back to poor economic decisions that have been taken that have had disastrous consequences for the people. And lastly, make sure you vote.
Indeed. And this panel has been about the upcoming elections, but democracy and a free society is more than just elections, in fact. It's what happens in between, and it's accountability. And there are many countries which are unfree, which still have regular elections. So it's up to us as civil society to ensure that level of accountability and to protect the rights of the individuals in our societies. So I wanted to thank our panel very, very much for participating. And I thought that we had a very lively discussion, and I hope that we have some more interesting conversations throughout the course of today and tomorrow. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been instructed to notify you about the next breakaway events. So they will be happening not in this room, but in the Degama room, and then also there'll be another event happening in the mezzanine level. So that's discovering solutions for institutional reform amid political uncertainty, and then also habits of highly successful Atlas network partners. I'm not sure which of those is happening in which room, but you can consult your your app on your phones, or one of the Atlas network staff here who will happily direct you to your preferred venue. That's it from us. Thanks again.